A teacher challenges a struggling boy in front of the whole school. But what follows will leave everyone speechless. Watch till the end. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. The Grand Hall at Jefferson Middle School was built to inspire fear and respect. Its polished wooden floors reflected the tall windows that stretched from one end of the room to the other. On the walls, rows of portraits displayed the stern faces of scholars, athletes, and alumni who had brought glory to the school in decades past. Their eyes, painted with a lifelike sharpness, seemed to watch every student who entered the room. To most children, those portraits were only decorations. To 12-year-old Daniel Williams, they felt like judges. Daniel sat at a small desk near the center of the hall. His thin frame shook slightly as he adjusted himself on the hard wooden chair. His fingers gripped the pen so tightly that his knuckles turned pale. Tiny beads of sweat glistened across his forehead. His shirt was a size too large and frayed around the sleeves, the shoes on his feet were scuffed and patched, and the backpack slumped beside his chair looked more like a bundle of stitched fabric than something new. To everyone in the room, Daniel was easy to overlook, another poor kid who would never rise above mediocrity. Around him, the other students sat in rows, whispering to each other with the excitement that comes before a public humiliation. Their faces turned toward him again and again, grins tugging at the corners of their mouths. The whispers sliced through the silence, crueler than words spoken aloud. Daniel felt each one burn against his ears, but he kept his eyes on the desk, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing his pain. At the front of the room stood Mrs. Lawrence, the teacher. She was respected by some, feared by most, and infamous for her sharp tongue. Her hair, pulled tightly into a bun, only heightened the severity of her expression. Today, however, her expression carried something extra, a smirk that curled her lips upward in mocking amusement. She let the silence linger for a moment, waiting until every eye in the room was fixed on her. Then her voice, crisp and cutting, echoed across the hall. "If Daniel passes this test, I'll tear my diploma in half." The words fell like a slap. A gasp spread through the students, some clutching their mouths, others suppressing laughter. Mrs. Lawrence crossed her arms, clearly enjoying the spectacle she had created. She laughed, a harsh sound that bounced across the wooden panels. Her confidence filled the air, a cruel certainty that the boy sitting trembling at his desk could never rise to the challenge. Daniel swallowed hard. The weight of her words pressed against his chest like a stone. She had made a public declaration, turning his struggle into entertainment. If he failed, the laughter would be endless. If he somehow succeeded, the teacher herself had sworn to humiliate her pride. For him, there was no middle ground. This was no ordinary exam. This was a trial. His mind drifted for a moment to his life outside these walls. He thought of his mother, Monica Williams, who spent long hours hunched over fabric at a sewing factory, returning home each night with tired eyes and sore hands. He thought of the nights he lay awake listening to the hum of the city outside, waiting for her key in the door. And he thought of his father, who had walked out of their lives years ago, leaving behind only silence and unanswered questions. Daniel had never been the brightest student. His grades were average at best. His teachers rarely had patience for him. To most adults in the building, he was invisible. But inside him, there was something no one saw. A quiet spark, hidden beneath layers of doubt and ridicule. A determination to prove, if only once, that he was not what others believed him to be. The sun streamed through the high windows, casting golden light across the desks. The test papers were handed out, sliding across wooden surfaces until one landed in front of Daniel. He stared down at the sheet, his hand hovering above it. His heart pounded against his ribs. All around him, students leaned back in their chairs waiting for the show. Some whispered jokes, others snickered quietly. Daniel could feel their eyes boring into him, waiting for him to stumble, to fail spectacularly. Mrs. Lawrence leaned against her desk, arms folded. "Begin," she commanded. Daniel lowered his eyes to the paper. His hand moved hesitantly at first, the pen trembling across the surface. The numbers and words blurred together, a storm of doubt threatening to swallow him whole. But then he took a breath. He thought of his mother's tired smile, of the nights she reminded him that he was capable of more than he believed. And slowly, the storm in his mind began to clear. The pen steadied in his grip. He wrote the first answer, then another. Each stroke of ink felt like a step forward, like a challenge to the voices that told him he wasn't good enough. The whispers around him faded into a distant hum. The portraits on the walls, once stern judges, now felt like silent witnesses. He didn't know how the rest of the test would go, or if Mrs. Lawrence would keep her word. But he knew one thing. Today he would not lower his gaze. Today he would fight for his dignity. And as the golden beams of sunlight spread across the hall, Daniel Williams began the battle that would change everything. The hall remained filled with the scratching of pens as every student bent over their test papers. Yet Daniel Williams felt as though he sat alone in an arena, his struggle exposed for everyone to see. His heart pounded so hard that he feared the others could hear it. The first questions stared back at him, their printed ink crisp and unforgiving. He lowered his eyes, took a shallow breath, and tried to focus. His hand shook as he traced the words with his pen, but the fear did not leave. His mind flickered through memories that always seemed to haunt him during moments like this. He saw his father's back walking out the door when Daniel was just 5, leaving nothing behind but anger and silence. He saw his mother, Monica, hunched over her sewing machine late at night, the lamp casting a pale light on her weary face. She always told him he was smart, even when his grades suggested otherwise. "You've got something in you, Danny," she would whisper. "You just don't see it yet." He clung to those words now as if they were a lifeline. The questions blurred before his eyes. For a moment, despair threatened to take hold. Around him, he heard the faint snickers of his classmates, the muffled coughs disguising their laughter. They were waiting for him to stumble, waiting for him to prove them right. He tightened his grip on the pen, the plastic biting into his palm. He refused to give them that satisfaction. Daniel forced himself to write something on the first line. The letters looked messy, uneven. His heart raced faster. But then he forced himself to breathe slowly, deeply, the way his mother taught him when fear kept him awake at night. "One breath at a time," she always said. He read the first question again, slower this time. It wasn't impossible. He thought carefully, pieced the problem together in his mind, and scribbled the answer. A small flicker of relief lit inside him. He moved to the second question. Again his hand trembled, but this time less than before. The answer surfaced after a pause as if hidden behind a door in his mind that had finally begun to open. His pen moved more confidently, leaving ink trails that were no longer timid scratches but words with weight. Still, the pressure did not let up. Every time he hesitated, he felt the heat of Mrs. Lawrence's gaze. She leaned against her desk, arms crossed, her smirk never far from her lips. She had made her declaration in front of everyone, and Daniel knew she expected to be proven right. But he was tired of being her example of failure. He pressed forward. Each problem he solved chipped away at the wall of fear that had built up around him. His classmates' whispers grew faint, like echoes down a long hallway. Their laughter, once sharp and painful, dulled into meaningless noise. The world narrowed to the test in front of him and the pen in his hand. Memories of the past rose and fell as he worked. He remembered the afternoons he'd spent sitting by the window while his mother mended clothes, the sound of her needle clicking through fabric, and the stories she told him of people who had risen above the odds. He remembered the sting of teachers' words, calling him lazy or careless, never once stopping to see how hard he tried. Each memory was like fuel, feeding the fire that had begun to burn in him now. At first his progress was slow, but soon it quickened. The more he wrote, the more his confidence grew. The ink flowed across the paper in steady lines, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt as though he had control. He was not powerless. He was not invisible. The whispers behind him quieted as his classmates realized he wasn't breaking. He wasn't faltering or staring blankly at the page. His head was bent low, his pen moved with purpose, and his answers filled the once blank space. The same students who had smirked moments earlier now watched in uneasy silence. Mrs. Lawrence's smirk remained, but something flickered in her eyes, something uncertain, something unsettled. Daniel didn't notice. He couldn't. His entire world was narrowed to the test, each question falling one after the other like dominoes tipping forward. His body still trembled, but his mind no longer did. This was more than an exam. This was a battle for his dignity, for the right to believe in himself. And step by step, question by question, he was refusing to surrender. When the sunlight shifted slightly across the floor and the clock above the hall ticked deeper into the hour, Daniel realized something had changed. He wasn't just writing answers, he was fighting back. Fighting against the voices that had told him he was nothing, fighting against the teacher who mocked him, fighting against the weight of a world that always seemed eager to see him fail. And in that moment, Daniel Williams knew. Whether he passed or failed, today would not be like all the others. Today, he was no longer the boy who lowered his head in silence. Today, he was standing tall, even if it was only in his heart. The steady scratching of pens filled the hall like the ticking of countless clocks. Yet, for Daniel Williams, time had changed its rhythm. The fear that had chained him at the start of the test was loosening. With every line he filled, with every answer that took shape, he felt something stirring inside, a strength he had never trusted before. He bent low over the paper, his eyes sharp, his breathing even. The whispers around him, once knives yannins at his confidence, now sounded like muffled echoes. A few classmates tried to stifle laughs, expecting him to stumble, but when the minutes stretched and he continued writing, their amusement faltered. One by one, heads turned in his direction, curiosity replacing mockery. At the front of the hall, Mrs. Lawrence leaned against her desk. Arms folded, chin lifted, her smirk lingered, but there was a faint tension in her posture now. She had mocked Daniel for years, convinced he would never rise above the shadow of mediocrity. But something about the boy at the desk unsettled her. His movements were no longer timid. His pen did not hesitate. Daniel, unaware of her shifting expression, pressed forward. Each problem unlocked the next, as if doors in his mind were opening one after the other. He remembered late nights at the kitchen table, his mother hovering nearby as she patched clothes. "Don't ever think you're less than anyone else," Monica would say, her voice tired but firm. "You just need to find your way." He had always nodded but never believed her, not fully. Now, with each answer he scribbled, he began to believe. The ink glided smoothly across the page. Equations balanced themselves beneath his hand. Sentences formed with clarity, his thoughts flowing with a confidence he had never felt before. His body still trembled slightly, but inside a fire burned. It was not the fire of anger or fear, but of determination. Minutes slipped by unnoticed. The classroom shifted. Those who had whispered grew silent, the portraits on the walls stern and unyielding, seemed no longer to judge but to witness. Daniel's classmates exchanged uneasy glances, the certainty of his failure dissolving. For Daniel, this was no longer about the test. It was about more. It was about every time someone told him he wasn't good enough, every time a teacher dismissed him, every time a student laughed at his clothes or his stumbles. This was about proving, not to them, but to himself, that he was capable. He paused once, his pen hovering above the paper, when doubt tried to creep back in. His throat tightened, and for a heartbeat, the whispers returned, sharper than before. But then he clenched his jaw, straightened his back, and pushed forward. Not this time, he thought. Not today. Across the hall, Mrs. Lawrence narrowed her eyes. She had seen many students crumble under pressure, their shoulders sagging, their pens abandoned. Daniel was supposed to be one of them. Yet, here he was, pen racing, eyes burning with focus. She felt the corner of her confidence waver. The other students leaned forward in their seats, watching. The boy they had mocked, the one they called weak, was different now. His silence was no longer submission. It was strength. Daniel wrote until his wrist ached. He shifted, rolled his shoulder, and kept going. The sun, pouring through the tall windows, had moved further across the floor, turning the hall into bands of gold. The light caught the side of his face, and in that glow, he felt something he had never felt before. Pride. Not the shallow pride of applause or recognition, but the deep pride of knowing he was given everything he had. The smirk on Mrs. Lawrence's face faded completely. She watched him with narrowed eyes, unsettled. For the first time, she wondered if her careless promise, the vow to tear her diploma if he passed, might return to haunt her. Daniel pressed his pen to the last question on the page. His hand no longer trembled. The answer came to him, steady and sure, as though it had been waiting for this moment all along. He filled the final line, placed his pen down for a second, then lifted it again, double-checking his work. He corrected a figure, added a note, and then leaned back with a deep breath. The whispers in the hall had died entirely. The silence was heavy, not with ridicule, but with something new: respect, unease, and awe. Daniel looked at his paper, every blank space conquered, every problem faced head-on. He did not smile. Instead, he sat in quiet determination, his heart steady, his spirit unbroken. For the first time in his life, he felt the power within him was real. The ringing of the final bell cut through the silence of the hall. Pens dropped onto desks, chairs creaked, and a collective sigh of relief swept across the room. But Daniel Williams sat still, his pen resting on his completed paper. His chest rose and fell quickly, his hands trembling slightly, but his eyes were steady. He had faced every question. He had left no blank. Mrs. Lawrence pushed away from her desk with deliberate calm. The sharp echo of her heels on the polished floor carried across the hall as she strode toward Daniel. Her smirk had returned, but it was thinner now, stretched over unease she tried to hide. "Collect your papers," she ordered, her voice crisp. One by one, the students handed over their sheets. Whispers began again, though they were different now, less mocking, more curious. All eyes drifted toward Daniel as Mrs. Lawrence stopped at his desk. She plucked his test from the table, her fingers brushing the edge of the page as though she expected it to disintegrate in her hands. Daniel sat motionless, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. He refused to look down. For the first time, he met her eyes. Mrs. Lawrence gave a small, sharp laugh and turned away, clutching the papers. She stood at the front, flipping through the first few with mechanical speed. Then she reached Daniel's. Her eyes scanned the first line, then the second. Her smirk twitched. She read faster, her expression hardening. She slowed, then read again, slower this time. Her face began to pale. The students leaned forward in their chairs, craning their necks to see what was happening. The room, once alive with restless energy, fell into a heavy hush. Daniel kept his gaze steady. He wanted to look away, wanted to shrink back into himself, but something inside him held firm. He had given everything he had, and now he refused to hide. Mrs. Lawrence's eyes darted across the page, each answer more precise, more confident than the last. The sentences were clear, the equations correct, the logic flawless. Her fingers tightened around the paper. She turned to the second page, then the third. Every line, every figure was right. By the time she reached the end, her smirk was gone, her jaw clenched, her breath shallow. She read once more, as if searching desperately for a mistake, a reason to dismiss him. But there was none. Daniel had not just passed, he had excelled. Gasps rippled through the hall as Mrs. Lawrence lowered the paper. The students exchanged wide-eyed glances, whispers bursting back to life. They had expected failure, humiliation, another day of Daniel being the target of ridicule. Instead, they were witnessing something extraordinary. Mrs. Lawrence's hand trembled slightly as she held the paper, her eyes lifted, meeting Daniel's across the room. For the first time, she saw not a timid boy with scuffed shoes and patched clothes, but a student who had silenced an entire hall with his work. The promise she had made echoed in the silence. "If he passes, I'll tear my diploma in half." The words hung like a noose tightening around her pride. Daniel did not speak. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any shout. His work, every line of ink on that paper, spoke for him. The students leaned closer, waiting. Some smirked, expecting her to twist her way out of the vow. Others held their breath, knowing that a teacher's pride was about to meet its reckoning. Mrs. Lawrence clutched the paper tighter, her knuckles white. She turned to the wall where her diploma hung in its polished frame, a symbol she had used to shield herself, to remind students of her authority and superiority. For years, it had been her proof that she belonged above them. Now, compared to the brilliance of the boy she had mocked, it looked fragile. The silence in the hall was suffocating. Daniel kept his eyes on her, his heartbeat steadying. Whatever happened next, he knew he had won. The silence in the hall stretched unbearably long. Mrs. Lawrence stood rigid at the front, Daniel's test still in her hand, her eyes flicking between the paper and the diploma on the wall. Every student in the room sat frozen, breaths caught in their throats, waiting for what would happen next. The promise she had made, mocking, cruel, meant to humiliate, now returned to her like a weight too heavy to bear. Daniel sat upright at his desk, his back straighter than ever before. He did not look away. He did not bow his head. His dark eyes stayed locked on Mrs. Lawrence, and for once he felt no fear. He had fought his battle, and he knew the outcome was no longer his to control. Mrs. Lawrence's hand shook as she reached up to the wall. The polished frame that held her diploma gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, a symbol of all her pride and authority. Her fingers lingered on the edge of the frame. The class held its collective breath. At last, she pulled the frame down, the glass catching the light. She opened the back with trembling fingers and removed the diploma, the parchment crisp and heavy in her hands. She stared at it for what felt like an eternity, her pride warring with the truth she could no longer deny. Then, in one sharp motion, she tore it in half. The sound of the paper ripping cut through the hall like thunder. Gasps erupted from the students. Some covered their mouths, others sat wide-eyed in stunned silence. No one had believed she would actually do it. But the halves of the diploma now hung limp in her hands, torn beyond repair. Daniel's chest tightened, and a single tear slipped down his cheek. It was not from sadness, but from a victory he had never thought possible. For once, he was not the boy mocked for his mistakes. He was not the shadow in the back row. He was Daniel Williams, and he had proven to himself and everyone else that he was worthy. The students' whispers turned to murmurs of awe. Even those who had laughed at him now looked at him with respect, some with shame. A new silence fell, not heavy with judgment but charged with recognition. Mrs. Lawrence lowered the torn diploma, her face pale. For the first time she seemed smaller, humbled, stripped of her unshakable superiority. She glanced back at Daniel, and in her eyes there was no smirk, no mockery, only the sting of humility. The bell rang, dismissing the students, but no one moved at first. Slowly, the children gathered their belongings and filed out of the hall, still whispering about what they had witnessed. Some glanced at Daniel with newfound respect, others with something like guilt. Daniel rose from his seat, clutching his worn backpack. He did not need applause. He did not need cheers. His victory was quiet, but it was his. As he walked out of the hall, he felt taller, stronger, as though the weight he had carried for so long had finally lifted. That evening, at home, his mother Monica listened as he told her what had happened. She dropped the shirt she was mending, tears streaming down her face as she pulled him into her arms. "Danny," she whispered, her voice breaking with pride, "you did it. You showed them. You showed yourself." For the first time in years, Daniel saw her smile not through exhaustion, but through pure joy. Word of the event spread through the school. Students who had mocked him now treated him differently. Teachers who had dismissed him began to look at him with new eyes. And Mrs. Lawrence herself changed. The humiliation she had endured humbled her. For the first time in her career, she realized that teaching was not about crushing weaknesses, but nurturing strengths. She saw Daniel not as a burden, but as a reminder of what it truly meant to guide a student. From that day forward, Daniel Williams walked taller. Not because others respected him, but because he respected himself. He had proven that his struggles did not define his limits. His quiet brilliance had finally been seen, and in that moment, a new future had opened for him. And so, in the golden light of that unforgettable afternoon, in a hall once filled with whispers and ridicule, a boy who had been underestimated rose above it all. His victory was not loud, but it was undeniable. Daniel Williams had found his dignity, and with it, the strength to never bow his head again. This story proves that true strength comes from never giving up. If it inspired you, hit like, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts in the comments.